Hi everyone. Our second motor control theory presentation here is on dynamical systems theory. So I made a couple comments about some differences with this theory compared to motor program-based theories in the last lecture. We're going to dig into a little bit deeper in that here today. So dynamical systems theory is a much larger theory that goes well beyond motor control and explains a lot of different phenomena, really in any area of science, any area of life forms, essentially. So when we look at dynamical systems theory in terms of how we might think about it in motor control, we recognize that this theory views human movement control as a complex system that behaves similarly to any complex biological or physical system. The dynamical systems theory is used in a lot of areas like math to try to identify and explain different patterns that emerge. We think about patterns that emerge in nature. It can explain a lot of things like that. And so we're basically trying to take that approach and apply it to human movement. So within dynamical systems theory, one of the main premises is that we observe nonlinear behavior. So that means when behavior changes happen, they don't happen progressively over time. They happen abruptly based on a reaction to some particular change. So a basic example we could look at that is when we heat water. So if we put a pot of water on the stove, for a long time it's going to look the same, and then suddenly it's going to change and it's going to be boiling. And so the behavior of that water, the ions in the water become very different all of a sudden. So I hit a certain temperature and we see a nonlinear change in the behavior of the water. So we're going to look at some examples of the same thing happening with the motor system. So before we get to the human motor system, we're going to look at a couple other examples here that kind of show these changes in action. Okay, so this first one is a diffusion experiment. So what you're seeing here is they have a glass of cold water and a glass of hot water, and they're going to be pouring a dye in there to see what happens. My taskbar is getting in the way here. Let's try to play this. Cold water, hot water, they're going to put in some ink and see how the ink disperses. You can see pretty clearly there's already some changes in how the ink disperses in the water based on whether the water's hot or cold. It'll continue to wash here for a little bit, see some other changes that occur. So same amount of time, this ink seems to pretty much have disappeared over here. This is still moving through pretty slowly. And now we're going to add vinegar and see what that does. What we see in play here in this example is we see some different behaviors emerging. We see that if we manipulate certain factors like heat or adding another influence like vinegar, completely changes the pattern of how that water and how the ink behaves. And then a second example, open here. This is an example of cymatics. If you ever heard of cymatics, this is pretty cool.
Mine and cymatics expert, John Stuart Reid, and he's kindly recreated for us the Chladni experiment. What we can see here is
what we're seeing here is through the frequency of vibrations. So they have basically this platform mounted on top of a speaker. They're changing the frequency of the noise coming out of the speaker, and as they do that, this is just some fine particle sand that's put on top of this platform. You can see really clear changes, shifts in behavior of this sand based on the frequency changes of the sound.
A metal sheet, this time connected to a sound driver and being fed by a frequency generator. And as the frequencies increase, so do the complexities of the patterns that appear on the plate, as you can see for your own eyes. So,
I mean, that stuff, when we look at cymatics, it kind of looks almost like magic. You're trying to understand how does that happen. Just through changing the frequency that's coming through that speaker, you're seeing really complex behaviors emerge of how this sand is forming. So you see those complex patterns that emerge. and we see that it's continually shifting, and those shifts happen in a very nonlinear fashion. So it's going, it's the same, it's the same. We see maybe some tiny changes, and then all of a sudden this rapid shift to a totally different pattern. So these are nonlinear changes that we see that can be explained by dynamical systems theory. Clearly, this is completely outside of anything we're looking at with human movement, but we have pretty good evidence now that a lot of human movement follows those same types of patterns, that we don't necessarily move in the way that we move just because that's the way that we've always been taught to move. We move in the way we move because that's the most efficient way for our body to do so. And when certain factors get manipulated, that can cause us to shift and suddenly adapt to a different movement. And so a lot of times those shifts are happening without conscious intervention. We're doing it just because that's the most efficient way for us to actually move in that scenario. So we'll unpack that a little bit more coming up here. So basically, when we're thinking about human motor control, we understand here that the human motor system is attracted to stable conditions. So just in that last cymatics example, the sand is attracted to stable position. So it's trying to get to a condition where it can stay in a stable pattern. So we shift to one pattern. It wants to stay there, but as something is shifted, as variables are shifted, in that sense, the frequency, that the condition that I'm in becomes unstable, and I suddenly am more attracted to shift to a different condition. So we want to stay in a stable condition. When the stable condition that we're in becomes unstable, we tend to find something else to suddenly shift to that becomes more stable. So we recognize that those variables influence a system, and that's going to help us to shift from one to another. So in the cymatics example, it was the frequency of the sound. In a lot of human movement examples, it's manipulating things like the speed of how fast we're moving, the force we need to apply to something, and that causes us to shift from one type of behavior to another. A simple example of that is if I'm picking up boxes off the ground. If I pick up several 5-pound boxes, I'm probably going to select one strategy to do that. And then if suddenly I need to pick up a 40-pound box, I'm probably going to lead off by starting to stick with my stable 5-pound box mentality of maybe just reaching down and picking it up. That's not going to work though, and I'm pretty suddenly and dramatically going to shift to a different lifting strategy. And again, importantly, I'm not often thinking, okay, now I need to move up to this box and squat down into a deep squat with a straight back and then pick it up. I'm just realizing I can't just reach and pick it up, so I'm going to adapt and do something else. So these changes, these shifts in behaviors can be modeled mathematically. There are certain researchers that is what they do. So they try to mathematically model shifts in human behavior in the motor system. That's useful and that's interesting stuff. What we're more interested in as practitioners involved in human movement is understanding behaviorally how these things can happen. And if I am seeing an undesirable movement pattern from someone, what variable might I be able to manipulate to influence them to move to a more efficient pattern? Okay, so looking at some classic experiments with dynamical systems theory in human movement, one of the first ones that comes up is this very simple experiment conducted by Kelso in the early 1980s, where we looked at the difference in phase movements and anti-phase movements. What in phase means is on the left side here, you can see that both pointer fingers are pointed inwardly. So I'm moving those both medially, and then I'm going to move both those laterally. So one's going to go out to the left, one's going to go out to the right. So if you focus just on the left side of the screen, I'm just going to jump back and forth here. I'm doing this movement where I'm pointing inward, I'm pointing outward. I'm just going back and forth in a rhythmic fashion doing that. That's an in-phase coordination. It's in phase because essentially what I'm doing is I am going 30 degrees toward the midline. I'm going maybe 30 degrees away from the midline, and I'm just going back and forth. So each hand is actually doing the same type of movement, even though it looks like the opposite pattern. My left one is going in, my right one is going in, and then they're both going out. So that's an in-phase coordination pattern. On the right side, we have an anti-phase coordination pattern. In this one, I'm basically keeping my fingers parallel throughout the whole time. So they're both pointing to the left, they're both pointing to the right. And so it looks like we might think of this as being in phase, but it's anti-phase because one finger is pointing in toward the midline, the other finger is pointing away from the midline, and now I'm going to shift. And so again, this one is, if I'm just focusing on the right side of the screen, I'm pointing to the left, pointing to the right, just going back and forth. So in these Kelso experiments, what they did is they had people practice this in-phase coordination. So the one on the left, so pointing in, I'm pointing out, pointing in, I'm pointing out. And they did that with a metronome. slowly over time, they kept increasing the speed of the metronome. So I want you to pause and I want you to actually do this. So just on your desk in front of you, put just your fingertips on the desk. If you've got a desk or anything in front of you, if you don't have a desk, just put your fingers in your lap or something. And I want you to actually practice this in-phase coordination pattern where you're pointing in, pointing out with both index fingers at the same time, just like the slide is doing right here. It's just going to go back and forth like that. So start kind of slow, just kind of a tap, 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 and now progressively get faster. Continue to get faster until you're going really as fast as you can. And what you should eventually see is that when you get to going as fast as you can, it becomes unstable. And unintentionally, you actually shift to the anti-phase coordination. So instead of going in and out with both fingers at the same time, you end up shifting so both fingers are in that anti-phase coordination where one points to the left, or they're both pointing to the left, and they're both pointing to the right. And so what this is a phase shift. So in-phase coordination became unstable enough that my motor system no longer could meet those demands, and it's seeking stability. So it shifted to a different coordination pattern that is more stable at that high speed. It shifted from in-phase to antiphase. So you should typically get the results if you sit there and actually try to do this of what we just talked about, the shift from in-phase to antiphase. So in unpacking that and understanding it a little bit, we need to understand some key concepts here. So we've talked about stability already. We know that our motor system wants to achieve stability. So we're trying to select movement that is very stable, that I can consistently do for a long time, that is energy efficient. So I'm trying to find a stable condition. And when I think about my different movement options in any scenario, so if I'm standing up right now and I need to get from here to my door to close the door, there are several movement options of how I can do that. I have certain movement options that are going to be very attractive, that are energy efficient, I can maintain for a long time, are simple to do. So, for example, if I just want to walk over and close the door and I'm not in a huge rush to do this, I'm just going to use my typical walking pattern. I'm going to walk over there probably kind of slowly, close the door, and walk back. If for some reason I'm maybe in a dangerous scenario where I need to have my door closed right now, I'm maybe going to do some type of a quick step and then a leap over the door, slam the door shut, and then a quick leap back, maybe get behind my desk. So, depending on what I need to do, I'm going to select the most attractive option at this moment. Okay, so if we think about attractor states can vary based on the conditions that we're placed in. So in this in this in this option right here, the experiment that we just did, the Kelso experiment with our fingers, in-phase coordination and anti-phase coordination, neither one. If I'm going at a slow speed, if I'm just moving back and forth nice and slowly, both of these are very stable conditions. And so either one of these is a decent option. If I was instructed to do the in-phase coordination pattern, though, I'm going to stick with that. It's stable at this slow speed. There's no reason for me to shift. If, however, now we increase the speed, now the in-phase coordination has become less attractive. I'm going to step up a pack. So one way to think about attractor states is think about each potential behavior pattern having a magnet associated with it. So if I have a magnet, I think about the magnet's trying to pull me in a certain direction. So imagine I'm metal, the magnet is magnetic, and it's trying to pull me in that certain direction. So if I'm standing right here in between these two, I have no reason. These are both kind of equally weighted. They have equal strength. There's not a clear winner here. So in our experiment, we wanted to start in this in-phase condition. So we started here, and right now, in-phase is pretty stable. Anti-phase is pretty stable too, but these are both equal, and so I'm already here, so there's no reason for me to shift. As we increase the speed, what happens is, you can see I made a little animation here. This magnet is becoming smaller. That's representing the fact that in-phase coordination is becoming less stable. So as I go faster and faster, as I get up to a pretty quick speed, it becomes pretty difficult to maintain this in-phase coordination pattern. And so at that point, the anti-phase coordination pattern we know is quite stable at a high speed. And so that magnet is growing and becoming stronger. So at some point, I'm no longer going to be able to resist the urge to be pulled over by that magnet and select an anti-phase coordination pattern. So these attractor states can become more and less attractive based on the manipulation of certain variables. If I were to, so let's say I'm going really fast and I had that sudden shift to the anti-phase coordination. Now, if we slow back down again, there's the potential I could go back to the in-phase coordination. But if I'm stable and if I don't have a reason to change, I'm probably still going to keep the anti-phase coordination because it's a stable pattern. There's no reason to need to change. Okay, so when I think about this concept of self-organization, the human motor system acting as a dynamical system, there's two critical types of parameters we identify: order parameters and control parameters. Order parameters are actually fairly similar to the concept of invariant features that we talked about with the generalized motor programs. So order parameters are things that are functionally specific. They define the overall behavior in a system, but they're fairly abstract in nature. So I can't really sit here and say, if I'm looking at a walking pattern, here are 5 order parameters that represent walking. They're kind of abstract, and they basically represent kind of the main core of what this movement is about. Control parameters, on the other hand, are things that I can manipulate. So control parameters are coordinated movement control variables that change based on the action desired. So a control parameter that we manipulated in the Kelso experiment that we just did was speed. So as I move faster, manipulating the control parameter of speed makes each of those conditions more or less stable. So as I sped up, in-phase coordination became fairly unstable, and I was forced to shift. I was pulled over to that more attractive state of anti-phase coordination. Other things I can manipulate are force. The example I gave of picking up different weighted objects, if the force becomes too high, I'm going to have a sudden nonlinear shift in movement where I was doing this for a long time. Now I'm not able to do that anymore, and so I'm going to shift to this more attractive option. And so we see these nonlinear changes as a result of manipulating control parameters. Phase shifts, I already discussed some. We discussed the phase shift in our experiment. But a phase shift, just to look at the definition of it, it's a sudden nonlinear change in movement that occurs because of manipulating a control parameter. So as we manipulate a control parameter, the current state that I'm in becomes more or less attractive. It becomes more or less stable. And as that system becomes less stable, I'm encouraged to shift to a different option. So in a gate option, maybe it's I've decided I can no longer, I'm late for class. I keep walking faster and faster. I'm walking so fast that it's feeling pretty awkward. And so suddenly I break into a jog instead. And so that would be a nonlinear shift in movement where I'm walking, walking, walking. And now walking has become so unstable that I need to shift to something else. And so I look at the idea of something like jogging at a subconscious level. I'm not usually saying, okay, I'm going to jog now. I just get to this uncomfortable point of walking speed where I just kind of start to jog. So things that influence phase shifts are going to be affordances and rate limiters. We talked about the concept of affordances a couple lectures ago a little bit. Just to review though, affordance is the fit between the characteristics of the individual and the environment that allow a certain action to occur. So these are things that I have going for me that make it easier for me to do a certain thing. The rate limiters are the opposite. So rate limiters, sometimes people just call these constraints. Rate limiters are things that are disadvantages that make it more difficult for me to do something. So if I think about height, height could be either an affordance or a rate limiter based on what type of a task we're doing. If our task that we want to do is dunking a basketball, my height as someone that is 6'4" becomes a great affordance that allows me a better chance of being able to do that. If my height is 5'4", I'm going to have a really hard time, and that becomes a rate limiter. On the other hand, if I'm looking at something like trying to win I can't think of what that's called, a limbo contest. So limbo contest, you're trying to get under a bar. Being 6'4" in a limbo contest is now a rate limiter. It's making it more challenging for me to be able to be successful. So when I look at this in a little bit more detail, we can expand on this to include something like Newell's model. So Newell's model suggests that the behavior that emerges in any given situation is a result of the interaction of characteristics of the person or the individual, the characteristics of the desired task, and the characteristics of the environment. And so if I look at these three areas, I can have affordances and rate limiters that are due to the individual, to the task, and the environment. So I identified the concept of height that could be either an affordance or a rate limiter in different tasks. So that would interact with the task of dunking a basketball differently than it would interact with the task of trying to go under a limbo bar. Um, the environment I'm in can influence some of these things. If I'm trying to dunk a basketball in a trampoline park, um, being 5'4" is probably no longer an issue because the environment has changed so that I can jump up and I can dunk the basketball. So um, in that scenario, these shifts in the interaction of all three of these things can lead to some particular changes in the movement. Okay, an over-encompassing concept that we need to know with dynamical systems theory is the idea of self-organization. So self-organization implies that not everything we do is a direct result of um, central executive intervention. So motor program-based theory would suggest that all our movements are programmed from using a generalized motor program that we've drawn from our memory stores and modifying it with specific schemas. So if we're looking at schema theory, that would be the explanation there. Dynamical systems theory operates under the assumption that many of our movements are completely self-organized, where we do not need to have any conscious intervention for those movements to happen. So what we look at with self-organization is when there are conditions that characterize a particular situation, we have stable patterns of behavior that are just going to emerge. So outside of human movement, an example we could look at is the concept of a hurricane. So hurricane is a specific stable pattern of weather behavior that emerges when certain conditions interact and produce a scenario that a hurricane is the most stable pattern. If those things shift, we can suddenly see a major change where this becomes just a tropical depression or really any type of a storm that is not associated with a hurricane. But when certain conditions all align with each other to create the right mix of things, a pattern of a hurricane is going to emerge. I'm going to come back to that one. If we look at an example within human movement, we would ask, why do we walk the way that we do? So is it that we've just always been taught to walk that way, and that's the generalized motor program that we operate? Or is it a self-organizing phenomenon based on the interaction of the muscles that we have in place, limb length, the way things are put together? And so there's some emerging evidence that suggests that the task of walking emerges in the way it does, more so just because of the interactions of our individual characteristics of our body parts and how that interacts with the environment. So some example we can look at that is this concept of passive dynamics. So passive dynamics is a branch of robotics where people essentially try to create robots that can walk like humans, and the passive portion of this means that there are no motors controlling these. So these are just organized in a mechanical fashion that they're able to continually walk. So if we take a look at this, I apologize that this is a small video screen and it doesn't allow me to make it bigger. But what they have done basically is they have balanced different lengths of limbs, different weights at the ends of them, to where when walking at a slight decline, this robot with no type of motor or anything walks remarkably similar to a human. So we see there's no motor here. There's nothing creating the movement like this. Just by the nature of walking at a slight downhill grade, we can produce something that's very consistent with the human walking pattern. So what this tells us is that we walk the way that we do, not because just that's how we learn, but that's because mechanically that's the most efficient way for us to do it. And so if we get injured, clearly something can change, and now suddenly I have kind of a different gait. So if I have someone that has knee problems for some reason, or maybe someone that needs a hip replacement, their gait pattern is completely altered because this typical pattern is no longer their most efficient mode. And so they haven't typically thought about walking differently. That's something that's emerged over time as a reaction to their injury. Last thing we'll look at on this slide is, you can wonder why this is up here. This will make sense a little bit more when we watch the video here. This is an old experiment. They call it here the decerebrate cat. Essentially, what they did is they made a lesion going up basically to a certain portion of this cat's brain. So when it's in this state here, This cat is still alive, it's still functioning, it's still moving, but it's doing so without executive function. So there is no signal coming down from the brain, basically because they have cut off the ability to do that. What we can see is this cat with some support, with some structural support, it's being held up by a couple of kind of slings. It can walk. Not only can it walk, as you increase the speed, it shifts to this trotting pattern, and you increase the speed some more, it goes into a full running pattern. It's three different. We have three different gait patterns that emerged without any interaction of the executive control. So no brain sending down a signal, no generalized motor program being activated. We had three different gait patterns that emerged as a result to manipulating the control parameter of speed. So this is pretty strong evidence that this isn't human motor control, this is animal motor control. Pretty strong evidence that certain behaviors self-organize without executive interaction from the brain. Okay, a few more things. So we came back to in the motor program-based theory lecture, we talked about the degrees of freedom problem. So we recognize that we can move in infinite different number of ways, and we need to somehow constrain the motor system to produce the movement that we want. So the main way that we understand this through a dynamical systems theory perspective is through the concept of coordinated structures. So a coordinated structure is a functionally specific collection of muscles and joints that's constrained by the nervous system to act cooperatively to produce an action. So if we think about what that means a little bit, I have selected all the people on my team that I want to move, that I want to work, and I've activated all those people at once. So we look at how we would do this. This is not that different from the explanation that we use with motor program-based theory. The key difference with dynamical systems theory is we're suggesting that this stuff can organize at a much lower level as opposed to coming from a motor program from the central executive, something that we've pulled from long-term memory. So some of our coordinative structures tend to be very intrinsic. So if we think about some of the basic reflexes that an infant would respond with different movements, those things are happening very intrinsically. There are other coordinative structures that we're developing over time. So if I'm thinking about a motor pattern that's going to help me throw a javelin, that's something I'm likely going to develop and learn over time. There are certain things that are inherent that are going to help me to select the right motor units and right muscles and deactivate the right motor units and muscles that are going to allow that behavior to emerge. But then it's something that's going to be kind of finely tuned or potentially majorly overhauled over time, where I can activate a different set of coordinative structures. Another related note here we'd look at is coordinative structures can compensate for weakness and injury. So if I think about different gait patterns, if I have very tight hip flexors or very weak hip flexors, I'm going to walk with a different gait pattern than someone who does not. If I have had major issues per se with my ankle, so if I've had major ankle surgery, my ankle structure is still not the way it needs to be, that is going to alter my gait pattern. That's going to have me selecting a different set of coordinative structures to produce a certain movement. Okay, this is a bit of review from one of our previous lectures. We want to come back to the concept of perception action coupling. So we looked at this in a loop in one of our earlier lectures. What we understand here, though, is what we perceive and the way we act is an interaction of characteristics of the performer in the physical environment. So if I have a set of characteristics, that's going to lead me to do certain things. And again, a lot of our actions in perception action coupling are happening at a lower level, information coming into the spinal cord and then going back out to effectors, as opposed to being organized through the brain. So what we look here, perception, our job is to pick up information from the environment. Action is to send out movement options that are going to achieve a certain goal. So there's kind of a neat experiment we can look at here.
How important then is this visual information in maintaining balance?
Okay. What we do in this experiment is we have a baby in this room. These experiments are also done with adults, though. This one just happens to be with a baby. What this is, though, is this is a fake room where the walls are not actually attached to the floor. So the walls are freestanding, they're hanging. And if we go back just a bit, we can see how the experimenter out here has the option to be able to move the walls independent from the floor. What this does is this produces, when the walls move, that the whole room is moving, and people have a physical response to that. So
The infant in this experiment has only been walking for a month.
Okay, get her to turn around, look at the wall.
Move the room backwards, the child falls.
Okay, so the wall comes in towards her, she backs up and falls down. Same thing again. This one, I think the wall goes out away from her, and watch her response there. So she kind of falls forward, stumbles forward. And so what this tells us is that the complex process of just maintaining equilibrium on a steady surface, so this floor is not moving at all, is very reliant on sensory information. So as our sensory information here kind of lies to us, we see a response where we feel the need to have a movement adjustment. And so these are happening at a subconscious level. I've actually talked to researchers that have completely understand this research, know what is supposed to happen, have gone into these rooms trying to fight it, and they can't do it. So at a very basic level, a very subconscious level, our body responds to differences in perception. So I think that I see the wall coming toward me, and I think something is throwing me off, and I have to have a physical response to alter my balance. So I think that I'm falling off balance. I think I'm falling, or I think I'm going backwards. Really, I'm stationary, but I produce a motor response because of what I'm perceiving. Okay, so to summarize this lecture, some key points we want to come back to. First one is that we know the human motor system is attracted to stability. So our desire is always to operate as efficiently as possible. We want to move in stable movement patterns. So I walk the way that I walk because that is a stable, consistent pattern that's energy efficient. We recognize, though, that when control parameters are manipulated, that can cause the stable system that we're in to become unstable, which leads to us being attracted to something that has a nicer looking condition. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn my phone ringer off. So again, when we have that phase shift, we're manipulating a control parameter, something like speed or force, and that causes us to shift to a more stable pattern. So we've gotten away from our pattern that's less stable, and suddenly we're going to jump over and do something else instead. Third point to recognize is that movements emerge organically as a result of affordances and rate limiters. So we certainly have some movements that we would operate that are operating from something like a generalized motor program where we're saying from our brain, this is what I want to do. But we also have a lot of movements that occur, a much larger portion of movements that occur throughout our daily life that just happen organically without us really thinking about it, operating at a subconscious level because of the affordances that we have and the rate limiters that we have in place. And so then the last thing, the key point that I've already kind of hit on here is that these movements don't need to be initiated from the central executive. There are a lot of movements that we do that are not likely operated from any type of a motor program. They are emergent. They happen just because that's the most efficient way for our bodies to do that. And so the easiest example to think about is if a robot that is set up with similar functions like a human can move in this way without any method of propulsion other than gravity, that suggests that that behavior emerges simply because it's efficient. We don't need to tell our body to move that way. We don't need to teach or learn the motor program for walking. It just happens because that's the most efficient way for us to do it. So we'll talk when we get back together in class and looking at some applications of this, how we would think about this in a skill practice, and then later on in class, in the motor learning portion of the class, we're going to start to talk about how can we manipulate different environmental and task and individual constraints to try to produce the movement that we want. So in a lot of these scenarios, we might see someone moving really inefficiently. It's efficient. The body thinks that's the most efficient movement because of something that's constraining it, but we can manipulate other factors to allow a better behavior to emerge. And so it's a really interesting way of teaching because we can get a behavior change without having traditional instruction of telling someone you need to do this, no, make sure this is here, and giving a lot of verbal prompts about how they need to move. Sometimes we can just manipulate something in the environment and we can create the behavior change we're looking for.